The line of them stretched from the edge of the rising sun back into the ragged blue shadows of the night not yet gone, a procession of bones and ears against a pale orange sky. There were 60 of them, though from a distance they moved as one creature, a long, slow serpent of hide and sorrow, making its way down the dry wash toward the single smudge of smoke that was the town. At their head walked a figure, small and wrapped in a coat the color of the dust they raised, their steps measured and unhurried because there was no other way to walk when leading the halt and the lame. Each animal was a study in what the world breaks and leaves behind, a collection of scarred hides, clouded eyes and gaits that hitched and stuttered over the loose rock. One had an ear torn clean in half, another dragged a back leg that never quite straightened, and a third bore the white, puckered brand of a company that had long since gone to dust itself. They were mules, the unwanted offspring of impatience and strength, and they carried with them the silence of animals who have learned not to expect kindness, only work. And now, not even that. The figure leading them did not look back, did not need to, for she could feel the weight of their collective exhaustion behind her, a physical presence that settled on her own narrow shoulders. She knew the rhythm of their breathing, the soft scuff of a worn hoof, the clink of a loose shoe on stone, and the weary sigh that passed through the herd like a breeze. The sun climbed higher, burning the color from the sky and turning the world to shades of bleached bone and shadow. And still they walked, a line of weary ghosts marching toward a town that was not yet awake to its own judgments. They were a sight of profound and terrible ugliness to anyone who valued speed or grace or perfection. But the woman at their head saw only the flicker of life that remained in 60 pairs of long, soft ears that swiveled to catch the sound of her footsteps. She was their compass. She was their reason for one more step. Afternoon. The heat had settled in the town square, thick and suffocating, driving most sensible folk indoors. But the auctioneer's voice still cracked and echoed against the false fronts of the mercantile and the land office. He was selling off the last remnants of the Kincaid Freight Company, a business bled dry by 2 bad seasons and 1 worse decision, and the crowd was thin, mostly scavengers picking at the corpse. Silas Croft leaned against a porch post of the land office, his own, his boots polished to a high shine that seemed to repel the dust that coated everything else. He was a man built of straight lines and hard angles, from his jaw to the crease in his trousers, and he watched the proceedings with the bored amusement of a man who already owned everything worth having. He was there for the wagons, maybe a few sets of good harness if they went cheap enough. He was not there for the livestock. No one was. The auctioneer finally got to them. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this fine lot of 60 draft mules?" A low chuckle went through the small crowd. Fine was not the word. Croft's foreman, a heavy man named Jeb, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "More like 60 bags of bones," he said, loud enough for all to hear. Croft smiled a thin, bloodless motion of his lips. The auctioneer, sweating in his wool coat, tried again. "These are hard-working animals, folks. Just need a little feed and a kind hand." The laughter was louder this time. Kindness was a currency with no value here. The bidding stalled before it began. From the back of the small crowd, a voice, quiet but clear, spoke a number. $10. All heads turned. It was Ilara, a woman who lived out on a small parcel of dry land at the edge of the valley, a place most people thought was worthless, much like the woman herself. She was weathered as an old fence post, her face a map of sun and wind, and she stood with a stillness that could be mistaken for timidity, but wasn't. Croft looked her up and down, a flicker of something, pity or perhaps contempt in his eyes. "For the lot?" the auctioneer asked, incredulous. Ilara gave a single small nod. Croft pushed himself off the post. "Let the old woman have her boneyard," he said, his voice carrying easily in the heat-shimmered air. "She's collecting strays. Seems fitting." His men laughed with him, and the rest of the townspeople smiled along, because it was easier than disagreeing with Silas Croft. The auctioneer, seeing no other offers were coming, banged his gavel. "Sold to the lady for $10. Ilara showed no reaction. She simply walked to the clerk's table, her back straight, and counted out the coins from a small leather pouch. She had just bought 60 heartaches. She had just bought 60 mouths to feed with nothing but a dry well and a patch of stony ground. She had just made herself the town's newest joke, and she did not care. That night, the Mules stood in her small, fenced pasture, a collection of dark shapes under a spray of cold stars. They did not move much, simply stood with their heads hung low, as if waiting for the next blow, or the next command that would never come. Ilara moved among them, a lantern in one hand casting long dancing shadows, her other hand holding a bucket of warm mash, a mix of bran and oats and molasses she'd spent her last dollar on at the mercantile. She went to the oldest one first, a great gray jenny with a clouded eye, and ribs you could count from 10 paces away. The mule shied away at first, a flinch born of long habit, its big ears flattening against its skull. Ilara stopped. She did not press, did not force the issue. She just stood there, her breathing slow and even, the lantern light soft on her worn face, and she began to speak to it, her voice a low murmur, not words so much as a sound, a current of calm in the vast, silent dark. It was the same sound she used to soothe spooked chickens, the same tone she used to coax a calf from its mother. After a long moment, the mule's ears swiveled forward, then relaxed. It took a hesitant step, then another, its nose twitching as it caught the sweet scent of the mash. Ilara lowered the bucket slowly, holding it steady until the mule dipped its head and began to eat, its lips soft and clumsy at first, then more urgent. She stayed with it until the bucket was clean, then moved to the next and the next, a slow, patient pilgrimage through her field of broken things. It took her half the night. For each mule, the ritual was the same, the cautious approach, the deep-seated flinch of fear, her patient stillness, the low murmur of her voice, and finally the tentative acceptance of a small kindness. She learned their injuries in the lantern light, tracing the raised lines of old scars with her eyes, noting the swollen joints and cracked hooves, the patches of missing hair where a harness had rubbed raw. These were not animals who had been worked hard. They were animals who had been used up and discarded, their bodies a ledger of neglect. She saw not their brokenness, but the simple, stubborn fact of their survival. They had endured. That was enough. As the moon climbed to its zenith, a quiet understanding began to settle over the small pasture. The frantic, hungry sounds gave way to a softer chewing, and the tense, rigid postures of the mules began to soften. They were not yet healed, not even close, but for the first time in a very long time, they were safe. They were home. Ilara finally sat on her porch step, the empty bucket beside her, and watched them. The night was cold, but she felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with the 60 quiet heartbeats in the field before her. They were hers now. The thought was a great and terrible weight. It was also a promise. Days later, the town's amusement had curdled into a kind of low-grade, persistent mockery. Men drinking at the saloon would make braying sounds when Ilara's name was mentioned, and the women at the mercantile would stop their chatter when she entered, watching her with a mixture of pity and disdain as she bought her small sacks of oats and bran. "Feeding those skeletons, Ilara?" the storekeeper asked one morning, his voice thick with false concern. "You'll be eating dust yourself before long." She simply paid for her goods and left, her silence a wall they could not breach. The joke had a life of its own now, a story the town told itself to feel better about its own hard scrabble existence. At least they weren't the crazy old woman with 60 useless mules. Silas Croft, for his part, seemed to derive a special pleasure from it. He would ride his fine bay gelding past her property, slowing to a walk to survey the scene. He'd watch her forking hay into the long troughs she'd built from scrap lumber, or meticulously cleaning the hooves of a mule patient enough to allow it. He never spoke to her directly, but he would speak to Jeb, his foreman, his voice carrying on the dry wind. "Look at that, Jeb. A fool and her money. Except she never had any money." Then they would ride on, their laughter trailing behind them like a dirty slick on clean water. Ilara never looked up. She never acknowledged them. Her focus was singular. The mules were beginning to change, the transformation so slow it was almost imperceptible day to day. But it was there. A thin layer of flesh began to cover the sharp ridges of their ribs. Their coats, once dull and matted, started to gain a hint of sheen under her relentless grooming. The vacant, hollow look in their eyes was being replaced by a quiet awareness. They were learning her rhythms, the sound of her back door opening in the morning, the specific cadence of her call. They learned that her hands, though calloused and hard, were gentle. She moved among them now, not as a stranger, but as a known quantity, a fixed point of safety in their uncertain world. She had names for a few of them. The big gray Jenny was Patience. A stubborn Jack with a notched ear was Deacon. A small, fine-boned mule who was terrified of everything was called Whisper. She was building a herd not on commands and whips, but on a foundation of quiet routine and unspoken trust, a language the world outside her fence line had long forgotten how to speak. She was tending her garden of broken things, and slowly, impossibly, they were beginning to bloom. Weeks later, the sky forgot how to rain. The sun rose each day not as a promise of light, but as a threat of heat, a brassy, unforgiving eye in a cloudless expanse of pale blue. The dust, once a nuisance, became a constant presence, a fine grit that coated every surface, worked its way into the lungs, and turned the evening light a mournful, hazy red. The river that bisected the valley, the lifeblood of every farm and ranch, shrank between its banks, its current slowing to a sluggish crawl, its color turning from a healthy brown to a sickly green. The town's wells began to run low, and the water brought up was gritty and tasted of mud. Panic, like the heat, was a slow-building thing. It started as whispers, worried glances at the sky, then grew into arguments at the mercantile over the price of feed, which was now being freighted in from counties that still had grass. Silas Croft's lands, vast and sprawling, were hit hardest of all. His great herds of cattle, symbols of his wealth and power, trampled the baked earth into a fine powder, searching for any stray blade of grass. He began selling them off at a loss, his jaw tight, his thin smile entirely gone. He started buying up smaller parcels of land from farmers who had given up, paying them pennies on the dollar. His offers framed not as predation but as a mercy. He was consolidating his power, feeding on the valley's desperation. One afternoon he rode up to Ilara's fence line, this time alone. He dismounted, the fine leather of his saddle creaking in the oppressive silence. He didn't look at the mules, who watched him with wary, intelligent eyes, but at Ilara, who was mending a section of fence with methodical, practiced movements. "Woman," he said, his voice flat. She finished wrapping a length of wire before she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Croft, He gestured vaguely at her small house, her dry pasture. "This is over. The valley is dying. I'll give you $20 for this plot, and I'll take the mules off your hands. Send them to the knackers. Put them out of their misery. It's more than this land is worth, but I'm feeling generous." His generosity was a threat, a dismissal of her, her work, her animals, all of it. He saw a problem to be erased. Ilara looked from his polished boots to his hard, impatient face. She thought of the 60 heartbeats in her field, of the trust she had so carefully earned. "They're not for sale," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was not a shout. It was a statement of fact, immovable as a mountain. Croft's eyes narrowed. He was a man unaccustomed to the word no. "Don't be a fool. There's nothing here for you. Your well will be dry by next week. What will you do then?" She did not answer. She simply turned back to her fence. The refusal, her quiet defiance, was more insulting to him than any argument would have been. He stared at her back for a long moment, the silence stretching thin and tight. He remounted his horse, his movements stiff with anger. He said nothing more. He didn't have to. 2 days later, the small creek that fed the aquifer for her well, a trickle that originated on Croft's vast upstream property, slowed to a drip, then stopped altogether. A new, hastily dug ditch now diverted its meager flow into one of his own stock ponds. The town saw it happen. They said nothing. That night, the sky broke. It was not a gentle breaking, not the soft, forgiving rain the valley had prayed for, but a violent, shattering rupture. Clouds the color of bruises had boiled up on the western horizon just after sundown, and by midnight, the world was a cacophony of roaring wind and cannon-shot thunder. Then came the rain, a solid, blinding curtain of water that hammered the baked earth and turned the dusty roads into raging torrents of mud. Ilara stood on her small porch, watching the deluge, a strange calm settling over her as the fury of the storm washed the world clean. Her mules, smarter than any horse, had already moved to the highest point of their pasture, huddling together, their backs to the wind, enduring as they always had. The storm raged for hours, a biblical flood that seemed intent on scouring the valley down to bare rock. By dawn, it was over. The sky was a scrubbed, innocent blue, the air cool and clean for the first time in months. But the world was transformed. The river, which had been a dying serpent, was now a monster, a churning brown beast that had ripped through its banks and consumed everything in its path. It had surged across the low-lying fields, tearing out fences, drowning livestock, and leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The worst of it, the very heart of the flood's fury, had been concentrated on Silas Croft's prized Bottomland. This was a vast, flat expanse of hundreds of acres right along the river, land that was notoriously difficult to work. In dry times, the soil was a hard-pan clay that could break a steel plowshare. In wet times, it was an impassable bog. The flood had done something strange and terrible to it. It had scoured away the useless topsoil and in its place deposited a thick black layer of the richest river-bottom silt, a gift of incredible fertility. But it was a poisoned gift. The land was now a quagmire, a sea of thick, viscous mud that would suck a horse down to its belly and mire the heaviest ox. The valley had been given the best soil it had ever seen, a promise of a record harvest that could save them all, but it was trapped, untouchable. Croft stood on the edge of it, his hands on his hips, staring at his impossible prize. He had a window of perhaps a few weeks to get seeds in the ground before the relentless sun returned and baked the new soil back into adobe brick. He had the best draft horses in the county, the strongest oxen. None of them could take a single step into that mire without sinking. His wealth was a mockery, a vast, black, fertile swamp he could not touch. The whole town knew it. They watched from the bluffs, their own hopes sinking with Croft's horses. The drought was over. The starvation had just begun. Days later, the bottomland began to change. The standing water receded, leaving behind a surface that looked solid, but was a lie, a thin crust over a deep, clinging morass. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying river life. The mood in the town was grim, a heavy despair that was in some ways worse than the fear during the drought. Hope had been shown to them, then snatched away. Silas Croft was a man consumed by a quiet rage, his attempts to work the land becoming more desperate and futile. He tried teams of 8 horses, then 10. They would struggle a few feet before sinking, their eyes wide with panic as they fought the mud's embrace, only to be dragged back to solid ground, exhausted and trembling. The townsfolk watched these failures, their own meager fields also too wet to work, their futures tied to the fate of that one vast, impossible field. Ilara watched too, but she was not looking at the struggling horses or the furious man. She was looking at the mud. She walked the perimeter of the great field each morning, her boots sinking slightly at the edge. She would crumble the black soil in her hand, feeling its texture, its weight. She watched how the birds landed on it, how their small feet distributed their weight. She saw something no one else saw. She saw a solution. She saw 60 of them standing patiently in her pasture. Mules were different. They were not horses. Their hooves were smaller, harder, more upright, less prone to splaying under weight. They were more sure-footed, their gait more deliberate. They placed their feet with a caution born of their donkey heritage. And they were lighter than the great draft horses Croft favored. Where a horse would panic and fight, a mule would think, would test its footing. She knew this not from a book, but from a lifetime of observation, from the quiet language of animals she understood better than that of men. That afternoon, she walked into town. She did not go to the land office to speak with Croft. She went to the mercantile, which had become the town's unofficial meeting hall. The place was crowded with grim-faced farmers and ranchers. When she entered, a hush fell over the room. The old joke. The woman with the boneyard. Ilara walked to the center of the room, her worn boots silent on the wooden floor. She looked at the faces around her, faces of men and women she had known her whole life. People who had mocked her, pitied her, and ignored her. That Bottomland, she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. It can be plowed. A scoff came from the back. It was Jeb, Croft's foreman. With what, Ilara? Wings. With mules, she said. The word hung in the air. A few men chuckled, but it was a tired, joyless sound. The joke was old, and no one felt much like laughing anymore. My mules. Jeb stepped forward. Those broken down things. They couldn't pull a plow through sand, let alone that muck. They'd snap in half. They won't sink, Ilara stated, a simple declaration of fact, and they won't quit. She looked past Jeb at the other farmers. I am not making an offer to Mr. Croft. I am making an offer to the valley. Let me plow that land with my animals. In exchange, the harvest is shared. A share for every family that helps with the planting and the reaping. A share for me and mine. It was an audacious proposal, an act of rebellion against the man who owned everything. The farmers looked at each other, a flicker of something new in their eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was a dawning curiosity. They had seen Croft's fine horses fail. They had seen his strong oxen fail. They had nothing left to lose. What harm could there be in watching one more failure? At least this one would be interesting. The next morning, the entire town gathered on the bluffs overlooking the Bottomland. It was a silent, skeptical audience, their arms crossed, their faces grim, ready to witness the final, foolish act in the story of Ilara and her lame mules. The air was cool, the sun just beginning to crest the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the vast black field. At the edge of the muck, Silas Croft stood alone, a rigid silhouette of fury and disbelief. He had not forbidden it. To do so would be to admit he thought she might succeed. His pride demanded he let her fail publicly. Then they appeared. A long, slow procession coming down the wash just as they had on the day they first arrived. But these were not the same animals. The 60 mules walked with a new purpose, their heads up, their coats clean and brushed. The gaunt, skeletal frames were gone, replaced by the solid, corded muscle of animals who had been well fed and well cared for. They were still scarred, still imperfect, but they were no longer broken. They were ready. Ilara led them, walking at the head of the line next to Deacon, the stubborn Jack with the notched ear, who was harnessed to a lightweight single-share plow. She didn't look at the crowd on the bluff. She didn't look at Croft. Her eyes were on the mud and on the animal beside her. She stopped at the edge of the field, the line between solid and treacherous. She ran a hand down Deacon's neck, murmuring to him, her voice too low for anyone else to hear. Then she gave a soft click of her tongue. She took a step into the mud. Deacon followed. The crowd held its breath. The mule's small, hard hoof sank a few inches, then held. He took another step, slow, deliberate, testing the ground before committing his weight. He did not flounder. He did not panic. He simply stood, solid and patient, waiting for her command. Ilara gave another click and a soft, "Walk on." The mule leaned into the harness, the traces went taut, and the plowshare bit into the rich black soil. It moved. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful motion. The thick mud rolled away from the blade, leaving a clean, dark furrow in its wake. Deacon walked with a steady, rocking gait, his ears forward, focused on his work, his feet finding purchase where the 1,000-pound horses had found none. He was not fighting the land. He was working with it. A sound went through the crowd on the bluff, a collective exhalation of breath. It was disbelief turning into wonder. Behind Ilara and Deacon, the next farmer in line led another of her mules, harnessed to another plow into the field, then another and another. Soon a line of 60 plows, pulled by 60 lame mules, was moving across the vast expanse of the Bottomland, turning the impossible soil. They worked in a long, silent echelon, their pace unhurried, their effort sustained. It was not a show of explosive power, but a demonstration of relentless, quiet endurance. The mules did what they were born to do. They endured. They put one foot in front of the other. They pulled their weight, and they did not quit. The sun climbed higher, and the furrows grew longer, stretching across the field like black threads, stitching the wounded land back together. The townspeople watched, their mockery forgotten, their pity transformed into a profound, humbling awe. They were not watching a joke anymore. They were watching a miracle. Croft stood frozen, his face a mask of stone. He was watching the source of his ridicule become the instrument of his salvation, and he was watching his power over the valley dissolve with every furrow they turned. He had been defeated, not by force, not by anger, but by the quiet competence of a woman he had dismissed and the hidden strength of the animals he had scorned. He turned and walked away. He did not look back. Weeks later, the Bottomland was no longer black, but a vibrant, impossible green. a sea of young shoots reaching for the sun. The corn stood waist-high. The beans were climbing their poles, and the squash vines were spreading across the rich soil, their leaves like great green hands. The harvest would be bigger than anything the valley had ever seen, enough to feed every family through the coming winter and beyond, with plenty left to sell. The land, once a symbol of Croft's untouchable power, had become the valley's communal garden, its bounty to be shared as Ilara had decreed. A new spirit had taken root in the town, one born not of desperation but of shared work and mutual respect. The men who had once brayed like donkeys now tipped their hats when Ilara passed. The women who had whispered behind her back now brought her fresh-baked bread and jars of preserves. They no longer saw a crazy old woman. They saw the woman who had saved them. They called her name with a reverence that was almost prayer. Silas Croft was a changed man, or at least a silenced one. He kept to his own lands, his power diminished, his authority broken by the 60 animals he had declared worthless. He had been offered a share of the harvest, the same as any other family, an act of grace from the very people he had sought to control. It was said he had accepted it, his quiet thank you to the councilman who delivered the news the first humble words anyone had ever heard him speak. Ilara herself was unchanged. She still lived in her small house, still wore her coat the color of dust. Her days were still measured by the rising and setting of the sun and the needs of her animals. That evening she walked through her pasture as the sky turned a soft shade of violet. The mules, finished with their grazing, came to her, nuzzling her hands and pockets for the pieces of apple she always carried. Patience, the old gray Jenny, rested her great head on Ilara's shoulder, her one good eye soft and trusting. Ilara stood among them, a small, still point in a sea of gentle, breathing life. She ran her hand over Deacon's notched ear and traced the old harness scar on Whisper's back. These marks were not signs of their brokenness anymore. They were chapters in their story, a story of survival, of resilience, of a strength the world had been too blind to see. They were not her lame mules. They were her 60 heroes. A quiet dignity had settled over the small pasture, an unspoken truth that hung in the evening air. Worth is not determined by the judgments of others, but by the quiet, steady work of the heart. It is found in the things that endure. It is proven in the furrows you leave behind. It's funny, isn't it? How we decide what has value. We look for the fastest horse, the strongest ox, the unblemished, and the perfect. We are taught to see the limp, the scar, the flaw, and to turn away, to dismiss it as worthless, as lame. We measure things by their immediate utility, by how well they fit the narrow purpose we have designed for them. But the world is wider than that, and true strength, the kind that lasts, often resides in the very places we have been taught not to look. It's in the quiet endurance of the things that have been broken and have healed. It's in the stubborn refusal to quit, long after the strong and the fast have given up. The world is full of lame mules, full of people and ideas and dreams that have been dismissed as useless, as a boneyard of failed potential. But what if the flaw is just a different kind of feature? What if the limp teaches a more careful way of walking? What if the scar is a testament to a battle survived? Perhaps the greatest value is not in what was never broken, but in what has learned to be strong in the broken places. Maybe the things we are so quick to mock are the very things that hold the secret to plowing the impossible fields in our own lives. I have to wonder, what is the lame mule in your life that you've underestimated? What quiet, stubborn strength have you overlooked in yourself or in others, simply because it didn't look the way you thought it was supposed to? Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story found a home with you, we'd be grateful if you'd let us know by liking it and subscribing for more tales like this one. Your support is the gentle hand that allows us to keep going. Until next time, walk on.